Jared Meek. Jared is a conservation and evolutionary biologist who studies how changing landscapes influence the diversity of life on Earth. Jared is especially in love with plants, mountains, and the plants of the mountains. He received his bachelor's degree in biodiversity and conservation from Brigham Young University and a master's degree in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from Columbia University, where he is currently pursuing a PhD. While the majority of his time is spent botanizing, he is inspired by the ways in which science and faith interact and foster a sense of wonder about the natural world. So with that, I'm going to let Jared start.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship for inviting me to give this little talk. I titled it Genealogy, Evolution, and the Tree of Life, but I could also maybe title it Jared's Belief System. But I hope as I talk about some of these things, you'll learn a little bit about yourself, some of your family history, and kind of ponder how connected we are to the other species around us. So this is just a cool quote that I found from the church website, talking about when Henry Eyring was a young kid. His dad was a really famous scientist, physicist, and he taught at Princeton. And President Eyring talks about when he was a young boy, they would drive to their church in Philadelphia, and the church had a mural of portraying Lehi's dream of the tree of life. So in the LDS faith, the tree of life is a really important symbol for us, and it tells us really kind of powerful story about our purpose on earth and how we can make it back to live with our heavenly parents. And I love this verse from 1 Nephi 11. It says, "I also beheld the tree of life was the representation of the love of God." And so for Latter-day Saints, this is usually what you think of, or maybe what comes to mind when you hear the words tree of life. This is another depiction of a tree of life. This is the evolutionary tree of life. And this just represents the connections between all the species, all the diversity of life on Earth, and how we all began as one single starting point here about 3.8 billion years ago. And I love this representation. It's a really cool diagram. But here's a different way of thinking about the tree of life. And this quote by Darwin kind of speaks to some of his thinking about how we're connected, and the processes that produce life on Earth are the same for all these organisms. So I just want to take just a minute, enter into the chat words that come to mind when you see the word or hear the word genealogy. I'll give everyone maybe 20, 25 seconds. What comes to mind when you see genealogy? Role models, family, my mom, family tree, ancestors, heritage, forebears, descendants. Cool. So I had some of the same words. I think about ancestors, roots, branches, related, DNA, things like this. So that's great. I want you to keep these words in mind throughout some of these next slides. So genealogy, kind of broken down, it just means the study of generations or the study of genes. So back to the Eyring family, here is President Eyring highlighted in blue right here. And up to the left is his father, Henry Eyring. And I just want to kind of start out by showing this pedigree. This is one way to think about relatedness among individual humans. I wanted to focus on the Eyring family because I read this really great book a couple years ago. I think many people have probably read this, but a good friend of mine who's an evolutionary biologist that I met up in Boston gave me this book, and I just love these two quotes from it. He says, "Here's the spirit of true religion, an honest seeking after knowledge of all things of heaven and earth. And this other one says, the creator of the universe has implanted a message in every created thing. Geology, astronomy, physics, and I would add biology. All science is really nothing more than an effort to read those messages. And so I want to really kind of focus on those messages and the messages that I study a lot in my research. So to me, DNA is the message that the creator has encoded the processes and the connection that we have for our life on Earth. So just kind of maybe a quick biology review for everyone. This is the basic structure of DNA. It's a double helix, and it's composed of 4 nucleotides. These are the names of them, but we usually just say A, C, G, and T. And it's really incredible to me that the instructions to make all life on Earth is encoded by these 4 simple molecules. And reading the sequence of these, reading these messages that are in the DNA of every species, we can understand more about how we're related. So DNA is packaged up into chromosomes, and humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we have 46 total, but 23 kind of unique chromosomes, and we get 1 copy of 23 from our father and 1 copy of 23 from our mother. So all this information, this message, this genetic code is compacted into these chromosomes. And the human genome, which, up until about 22 years ago, we didn't have a full understanding of. It's still not totally complete, but it's almost entirely complete that we have an understanding of the genome. It's basically a representation of these 4 nucleotides. And we can study this and compare the genomes of different individuals to see how they're related and detect differences among them. So here's a simple genealogical tree of 3 generations. And this is just showing all these chromosomes. Say this is just chromosome 1 in our genome. And so each person has 2 copies of chromosome 1. And during the reproductive process, those chromosomes recombine, and only a certain portion from each chromosome pair is passed down to the offspring. And so you can see in the second generation, which is called the parents here, the father inherits half of the blue and red chromosome. He inherits half of that from his father's blue chromosome and the other half from his father's red chromosome. And so with each succeeding generation, you're only getting 50% of your parents' genome. And so even though we share these chromosomes, we share this genetic material, over time, the similarity between generations kind of depletes because you're losing half each time, because only half is passed on to you. So this is another depiction. This is my family tree. At the bottom, there's me and my 2 brothers and my sister. And so all these numbers are in reference to me. Down at the bottom there, my genome, I am 100% me. But I share half of my genetic material with my brother and my sister and my other brother. We are 50% similar because we each inherited half of the material from our mother and half from our father. They in turn received half from their mothers and fathers. And so as you go up, you kind of decrease by half, so that by the time you get to your great grandparents, you're sharing 12.5% of genetic material with them, essentially. So this is important because people really want to know who they're related to, what their relationships mean, where they come from. But there's a big difference between your genealogical history and your genetic history. And there's a lot of research and kind of interesting things going into people trying to discover those parts of themselves. This is this cool paper that was published just a few weeks ago, showing that this big data bank has been used to produce a genealogical tree that's 100,000 years old. Here's an actual figure from the paper showing the relatedness between populations of humans over the past 100,000 years. And I just love this quote. It says, "The ancestral relationships of all humans who have ever lived can be described by a single genealogy or tree sequence, so named because it encodes the sequence of trees that link individuals to one another at every point in the genome." And so, yeah, just February 25th, 2022, there's work going on to make this massive human genealogical tree based on our genomes. And it's only very recently we're able to do anything like that at that level. So that's cool. So that's the intro to genealogy. Again, use the chat, and in about 20 seconds, what words come to mind when you see the word or hear the word evolution? Darwin adaptation, change in allele frequency over time, walking with dinosaurs. Amazing. I agree, amazing. Survival of the fittest after selection. Pokemon, that's the best one. Okay. Cool. Occam's razor, more relatives. Here are some of the words that I thought of: generations, ancestors, phylogeny, Darwin, DNA, biodiversity. So there's some related words here that we thought of when we saw genealogy. So I want us to keep those in mind going forward. So most people know about Charles Darwin, pretty amazing scientist from the 1800s, and he went on this awesome voyage around the world in 1831. And in 1835, he landed on these islands called the Galapagos Islands. And they were there for about 3 weeks. Didn't actually collect many samples there, but through later observations and records and samples that other people collected, he was able to kind of piece together some of his theories about natural selection and evolution. And I just wanted to highlight this. This is one of the few drawings that we have from Darwin, but it's many people consider it to be the first phylogenetic tree or evolutionary tree. And so here's his hypothesis about how species on Earth are related through ancestry, essentially, and it's in a tree format. So one of the really famous examples, of course, are the finches of the Galapagos Islands. I like this diagram a lot because it shows the relatedness among these different species in kind of a tree-like format. And essentially the kind of simplified idea is that over time, these individuals of the populations of each of these groups were adapting to different food types and different sizes of seeds. Some were kind of exploiting their environment for insects. Some didn't want insects, they wanted seeds. Some wanted the buds and fruits of plants. And so over time, based on what was most beneficial for them and which gave them the most, helped them be most successful to survive and reproduce, led to them forming these adaptations, becoming different species over time. So that was one of the main examples that Darwin used from the Galapagos Islands. He also focused on the tortoises of the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos actually means tortoise in Spanish. And while they were there, they, he heard anecdotal evidence about how the locals could tell which island the tortoise was from based on its shell. And so this is another, one of the other examples that he used, and later scientists kind of went back and did better collection efforts and really documented how the tortoises had diverged and adapted to their different environments and become separate species over time in the Galapagos Islands. So, when you first learn about Darwin in high school or in your college biology or evolution class, you usually hear about the Galapagos Islands. It's kind of almost a scientific kind of sacred place for a lot of people. And I was able to go to the Galapagos Islands a couple months ago with my brother-in-law and father-in-law and my dad. And this is what they call Darwin's Bay. So this is where it's thought that the ship he was on, it's called HMS Beagle. This is where the Beagle first anchored, and this is where Darwin and the people on the ship with him first came aboard the Galapagos Islands. And these are some of the species that were there that he observed and studied and wrote about, that I was able to see as well. So here, one of the finches, the marine iguana, cactus. Here's an example of the giant tortoises that one of the examples I showed earlier. And I thought it was just a really special thing that I got to be there with my family and kind of experience this important place in the history of science, kind of connecting what my love for nature with my family history as well. Here I am with Chuck D over here, a little replica. Here's my dad and I with this cool statue of Darwin that's over Darwin's Bay with really large, kind of misproportioned hands. I thought it was kind of funny. This is my father-in-law on the right. And I love this picture down in the bottom left. It's a souvenir shop, and there's a Christmas wreath. It says Feliz Navidad, kind of showing that science and faith really can get along. But I really like those memories I have from there. So here's the route that the Beagle went on. They left the UK in 1831, made it back in 1836. But Darwin really sat on this information and the data he collected and the thoughts he was having about the geology and the biology he had studied for about 20 years. Didn't actually publish kind of his most famous book on the origin of species until 1859. And part of the motivation for that, he wanted to make sure he had his data straight before he kind of proposed this really revolutionary idea. But another reason was at the same time, another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, was in the Malaysian archipelago and had been having similar thoughts about this theory of natural selection. And him and Darwin wrote letters back and forth a lot, and he sent Darwin this essay in early 1858. And Darwin realized, Alfred Russel Wallace had discovered had the same theory, and was kind of somewhat worried that his idea would be stolen. So they had their papers kind of joint published together in late 1858 or in the summer of 1858, and they're kind of credited as co-discoverers of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And then the next year is when Darwin published Origin of Species. So I'm kind of giving this background behind Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace to kind of say, I think at this time they were both inspired about the things they were seeing while they're exploring the natural world. And because of it, we have a greater understanding now of how life has evolved and some of the processes that generated our existence. So that's just a very simplified background of the beginnings of evolution. There's a ton of research that's been going on since then. And if you want, you can email me later and we can talk more about specifics about that. But what I really want to talk about is how we try and visualize evolution and the relatedness of different species. And we use something called phylogenetic trees. Phylogenies are basically hypotheses about how organisms are related and how they changed over time. This on the left is a family tree that I found just online looking somewhere, and it looked a lot like a phylogenetic tree to me, but these are family names. And over on the right is a very zoomed out phylogeny representing the three main kingdoms of life. So bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. So just to kind of give an overview of how we read phylogenetic trees, you'll have a bunch of these kind of ladder looking relationships, and the best way to understand it is those who share a common node here, a common ancestor, are more related than those who share a node further away from them. So taxon A and B, you can think of taxon just as a species. So species A and B are more closely related because they share a common ancestor here. They're more closely related to each other than either of them are to taxon C. But then when you come down to this node, this is saying, okay, taxon C is equally related to B and A because they all share a common ancestor here. And so I want to put that in perspective with a family tree. So here's a kind of reduced portion of my family tree. Here's me and my sister on the right. Here are two of my cousins on the left. And here are their parents. Is this and this kind of ancestor of them, right? So this is their parents, Jamie and Doug. Here are my parents, Sandy and Reed. And then here are my mom's parents, Faye and Harry. And so this is just showing Lauren and Kristen are more closely related to each other. They're sisters or sister species, sister groups, and they share more genetic material with each other because of this interior node, this common ancestor of their parents. But we are both, all four of us are related to each other through this common ancestor of my grandparents on my mom's side. So I hope that kind of makes sense, how you can kind of see these, read a family tree as basically a very, very, very zoomed in phylogenetic tree. The principles are the same. Same thing goes here. This is a phylogenetic tree of the hominid lineages. And so here on the left, Homo, this is the genus that we belong to, Homo sapiens. Pan over here is the genus that chimpanzees belong to. So one of the common misconceptions is that humans evolved from chimps. If you read a phylogenetic tree correctly, this is really saying, no, chimps exist right now, humans exist right now. We both evolved and came from a similar common ancestor. So chimps and humans come from a similar ancestor, but they're not descended from each other or anything like that. And so this just shows, going back in time, humans and chimps are more closely related to each other than gorillas, but gorillas are more closely related to humans and chimps than orangutans, and going back like that. So I hope that was clear. But here's how we kind of visualize now inheritance over generations of time. And so this is just a simple plant species. And this is just a subset of a population at one point in time. And so there are we're just focusing on 5 individuals that are parents, and they mate and they have offspring. And so this is showing the next generation. You can then zoom out and show that those 5 parent individuals and those 5 offspring individuals are part of a larger population where all these different relationships are happening, and genetic inheritance is being passed on over these 5 generations in a larger population. If you take away the individual plants from the diagram and just keep the kind of connecting lines, you get this top figure here, and it zooms out even more to be part of a very large population, which over time, you zoom out far enough, and this is showing what a phylogenetic tree actually depicts. So a phylogenetic tree is a history of the populations and the population relationships among generations for each species. And so when we think of our personal family trees, we're just a very, very, very zoomed in portion along the Homo sapiens lineage is kind of the idea here. Okay, so here's a somewhat recent, I guess it's 10 years old, but this is the best figure I could find of the mammal phylogeny, showing how we're related to the other primates, and then going back in time, the relatedness we have with other big groups in the mammal tree. The rodents here, carnivores, bats, things like that. And if you flip this up, it has a very tree-like shape to me, with the roots down in the ground, showing kind of the older ancestors. And as you come up, the tips of this tree, or the leaves on the branches, are the more recently evolved species. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm just kind of going to zoom through. Don't worry too much about, there's like a lot of content, but the principles, I'm just trying to show you how, as you zoom in from the whole big tree of life, you can get more and more details about the specific groups you're trying to study. But I kind of wanted to show these in kind of quick succession to kind of show you how, honestly, sometimes overwhelming it is to try and study and put these relationships together about all the different organisms on Earth. So this is a simplified tree representing the entire tree of life. Here up top, it says life. And so as I go through these slides, I'll have just focus on the red circles, essentially. And as you move up through time from 3.5 billion years ago, eventually you get to a point where about 1.2 billion years ago, a little bit beyond that, organisms get this adaptation, chlorophyll B, and they're able to start photosynthesizing. And that's where green plants kind of enter the picture of life on Earth. And so zoom in, every time I switch slides, we're going to zoom into that green triangle. So now this is all of the green plants, and you go through their evolutionary history, and we're getting to land plants now, which is the plants that most of us think of, our mosses, our pine trees, our flowering plants. But you zoom in, and here you see liverworts, mosses, hornworts over here, and it takes a lot of time still before we get to plants that have vascular tissue, meaning they can conduct water and food, and so they can kind of move further from water environments and move into more dry, arid environments. That whole tree continues to expand till we get to the seed plants, which are your conifers, spruces, pines, but also your flowering plants. We move through all that into flowering plants, and here is kind of a final simplified depiction of all the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. So most of what I study are flowering plants. I like this simplified one. I just wanted to show that real fast. But the groups that I study are all the way down here in this group called the Lamiids, and also some groups that aren't really shown here, but they kind of come in right here. And this is, again, an overwhelming figure, but this is just showing, here's all the different families of flowering plants that we know of and have classified. And so I hope that just gives you an appreciation of, zooming out to the large scale tree of life. And as you zoom in, how much detail is still needed and how much detail you can get at as we focus on these different parts of the tree of life. So as I said, I study this, I study a couple different genera, or different groups. One of them is in this family called the Orobanchaceae family. It's a genus called Pedicularis. And I study another group called Delphinium, and that's in this family called Ranunculaceae. If people know buttercups or columbine, it's related to those flowers, those plants. So I want to just kind of tell a little story about how family history and evolution has kind of influenced how I approach the world, how I view the world, and some cool experiences I've had doing research. So last summer, I went to California to collect a lot of Delphinium species. So this is, the common name for Delphinium is larkspur. If any of you live out west, you've for sure seen larkspur. And so I went with my friend Matt, a good friend from high school, and we drove. He lives in San Francisco right now, so we drove all around California collecting different species of Delphinium, because I'm trying to figure out the how they're related to each other, because we don't understand fully how the different species here in North America are related. And during one of the last few days I was there, we were driving and we passed this little monument, and it was a monument to the Mormon Battalion. And I thought that was really cool. I just didn't know that. I didn't really know much. I've heard about the Mormon Battalion growing up and kind of the story of them being enlisted to fight during the Mexican-American War, and they ended up not really fighting. But they did a big long march through the Southwest and ended in, it took about a year. They got to San Diego and they got discharged. That's all I really knew about it. And as we were driving, there was this old, it's now a Forest Service road, but the road was called the Mormon Immigrant Trail. And I just thought that was cool. I was like, wow, I'm collecting these plants, and there's some kind of history of my church in this area. So I got home from all of this field work and I was talking to my parents, and my dad mentioned that we had an ancestor who was in the Mormon Battalion, and who actually made it to San Diego and ended up kind of staying in California for a bit and helping out. And he was there when gold was first discovered at Sutter's Mill, kind of beginning of the gold rush. And he told me there's actually like a little short video about it. And so I looked it up on YouTube. Let me see. If anybody's interested, just go search for A Legacy More Precious Than Gold. It's this short 24-minute video. But my fourth great grandfather was like one of the main people in this movie, and I had never seen it. And I thought that was odd and kind of cool. And so I learned more about his story. Here's my family tree again. And here he is. His name's Ezra Allen. He's my fourth great grandfather. But his story is they were in Iowa when the U.S. Army came through and needed volunteers to join a battalion for this war. And he decided to enlist. And when he enlisted, he left behind his wife, Sarah, and 3 children in Iowa. They got to San Diego a year later. A lot of the people from the battalion kind of decided to go back, but some people stayed and helped build schools and post offices in San Diego and San Francisco. And then they were working at Sutter's Mill when gold was discovered. And then they decided they needed to get back to their families. But it was winter, and they were trying to kind of cut a road through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And Ezra Allen went with 2 other people as like a scouting party ahead, and they never came back. And the rest of the group, about a week later, tried to follow their trail and came upon 3 dead bodies that had been robbed and kind of buried in shallow graves there. But one of the cool things is, because they were there at Sutter's Mill for the beginning of the gold rush, each of them had some flakes of gold, and Ezra Allen had a little satchel pouch with gold in it, gold flakes. And they were like, somehow the robbers didn't see it or didn't take it. So the friends who came by afterwards picked it up and were able to take it back to his wife, Sarah. And she used that gold to purchase supplies to continue on the trek and make it to Salt Lake City. And there was enough gold left over that she melted it down and made like a wedding ring for her, and also a ring for her daughter. So I thought it was just a really special story that I had never heard about, and I heard about it because I was doing field work out in California. And so in the movie, it talks that the place that they were killed was this place called Tragedy Spring. And so I looked up Tragedy Spring, and here it is on the map. The orange here is the route that we took during that summer of field work. And here in blue is a place where I collected a larkspur species. And so literally, less than 10 kilometers away was where my fourth great grandfather had been killed, and was kind of, it was just really surreal, kind of cool moment for me to realize I was walking in the same area, 150 years later, just kind of picking daisies in this place. So on the right is this kind of large phylogenetic tree of Delphinium. And I don't know, I think it just kind of encapsulates kind of what I'm trying to get at here is the species the species around us were also present on the landscape when our ancestors lived there and were around there. And as we walk through some of our favorite forests or mountain areas, we're kind of essentially, potentially, if it's been a semi-protected area, possibly kind of walking among the descendants of the same species that were around when our ancestors were there. And so the trees you walk under or camp under or hike under, their parents were maybe your grandparents walked around under their parents, kind of idea. But maybe that's a little hand wavy, but I think it's a fun thought to think about. So later that summer, I did a little more field work. These are my good friends, Robert and Margaret from New York. They've since moved out to LA, but I was visiting them and I told them about the story about Ezra Allen. My friend Robert said, "Oh, I have an ancestor who is part of the Mormon Battalion." And so we went down to San Diego together and found a new, not new to science, but new to me, larkspur species on the way, and went to the Mormon Battalion Visitor Center and looked at the roster. And here on the right, his ancestor, Ira Jones Allen, and my ancestor, Ezra Gila Allen, are there on the same page. I just thought that was a really kind of powerful thing and cool moment that these fourth great grandsons somehow met each other in New York City and were able to go to this landscape together where their great grandfathers had been, 150 years ago. And I also got to go with my dad up to Idaho to where some of his ancestors settled near Preston, Idaho, and we found another larkspur species up there, which was a special thing. So anyway, this is a kind of a big tangent, but family history mixed in with the phylogenetic research that goes on. And so yeah, this is the point that I kind of want to make. Here's the route that I went on this last summer for field work, and here's the route of the Mormon Battalion down on the lower right. And it just made me ponder and think about my ancestor that lived not just in a specific time period, but in these spaces. And I guess I just invite you to think about when you're doing family history or thinking about where you come from, where were your ancestors living? What environments did they exist within, and what species were they interacting with? And think about how you're related to them, but also with other species. Here's another kind of anecdote. Here's my wife's family tree. And we have this is another form of family inheritance. Here's this chive plant that we have that belonged to her grandmother's sister. That last time we saw her, we were able to kind of take a cutting, and it's still alive and living. So the same plant that her grandmother's sister had, we have. And I think that's kind of a fun thing, this inheritance over time. And here is our family trees in the fan shape kind of put together. And I'm showing this kind of show depiction of the unity that we all have, actually. When you put a lot of us together, every human on Earth is related, essentially. We don't all share DNA, but we all come from ancestors that lived among each other and interacted with each other. And we also belong to this larger tree of life. So these are just 3 different phylogenetic trees, but they're in a circular format because you can fit more information on them. But here's a butterfly phylogeny on the left, flowering plants in the middle, and mammals on the right. And I just kind of liked this symbolism there between the circular family tree here and these circular phylogenetic trees. Which kind of brings me to one of my last points. So we're living in a troublesome time in a lot of ways, in too many ways. I'm not going to talk about all the ways, but for the environment, for species, living in this moment that a lot of people are calling the 6th mass extinction, where a lot of species are going extinct at a much faster rate than most scientists think is normal. So this figure just depicts these other 5 major extinctions in the past. This one here is kind of the last extinction of the major dinosaur groups, which allowed mammals to flourish and kind of overtake their environments. But in the present, a lot of human activity in these environments is causing a lot of species to go extinct. Here's a good figure showing the increase of extinctions over the past 500 years in a few animal groups. And this data comes from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They have this thing called the Red List, where they highlight the most threatened species and kind of assign them to different conservation categories to help try and help motivate conservation money and research and efforts to saving those species. But this is just showing, a big uptick in extinctions of these IUCN threatened groups in recent time. And then we're often seeing headlines like this, and this, and this, and this. And so it kind of seems like gloom and doom sometimes. But what I really kind of want to get across is this idea that we really should be concerned and care about all the species on Earth, because we're related to them through evolutionary time. I like this quote a lot. It says, "Each species' genetic code is like the sheet music of a symphony, each letter of its DNA a musical note, written, rewritten, edited, and reshaped over millions of years. Losing these species is like losing a great work of art or a tremendous library." So I want to close by thinking about this tree of life again, and a couple of scriptures from the Doctrine and Covenants. For those who aren't LDS, the Doctrine and Covenants is another important book of scripture to us. And this says, "For it is expedient that I, the Lord, should make every man accountable as a steward over earthly blessings, which I have made and prepared for my creatures." And so when you think about your ancestry, when you think about genealogy, I encourage you to also think about your relatedness to all of life on Earth. Zoom out a little further than a couple hundred centuries of your human ancestors and think about the other species that we've been asked to take care of and be responsible for. And think about ways that you can provide protection for them, be more compassionate or understanding about what we can do as humans to preserve the diversity of life on Earth. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, there's this really powerful moment, which is where a lot of our interest in genealogy as a faith comes from. And we believe that in the Kirtland Temple in Kirtland, Ohio, that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were visited by the prophet Elijah. Elijah is a prophet in the Old Testament. And he comes in, this last part of the quote here says, "He comes to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, lest the whole earth be smitten with a curse." And so when we don't really know for sure what that curse is, or ideas vary about exactly what this means, but this is big motivation for people to turn the hearts of our ancestors to the children, and then us as children to our ancestors. And it motivates a lot of the work that we do in temples for those ancestors. But I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Cedar City, Utah, Southern Utah University. And someone shared this idea about the spirit of Elijah not only working on Joseph Smith in the 1830s, but also working on Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. I think it's kind of compelling that around the same time that Darwin was on the Galapagos and finishing his voyage on the Beagle is when Elijah appeared to Joseph Smith in the Kirtland Temple. And then shortly after, Alfred Russel Wallace was also having ideas about evolution and how we're connected to life on Earth. And so I just kind of like that idea. It may not be right. It may be, I don't know, offensive to some, but I think it's a really special thing to think about how God has inspired a lot of different people over time to help us feel a greater connection to each other as humans, but also to the earth and the creations that he's provided for us. And so I guess I want to end. I wrote this little poem based on this idea. I'll share this screen. This is on a website that my friend made called Bristlecone Firesides, but I'll end here and leave this poem up, and just thank you for your time, and I'm here to answer any questions or anything. Thanks.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Jared.